Good morning and welcome to this town hall from the Independent Restaurant Coalition. I am joined today by my co-host Jeannie Chun, who is with Seattle Restaurants United, and our moderator Tara Smith, who's in DC. She works with the DC Hospitality Coalition and is opening a restaurant in DC in the coming weeks or months. Whether you're a founding member of the IRC or whether you're new to the coalition today, we're happy to have you. We look at the IRC as a broad coalition, and we'll talk a little bit later about definitions and who we're fighting for. But today is really meant as a chance for you to learn more about the IRC, to get to know some of the folks involved, both in leadership and some of the wonderful consultants that we have working with us, and meant as a peer-to-peer chat, a chance for us to share information with you about what we're doing and best practices and things that we've learned. We also have a few professionals, but I will start and we will go over this disclaimer a few times. This is meant as peer-to-peer advice. This does not replace the advice of professionals like your attorneys and CPAs, and it's not meant to replace that. So this is just an industry conversation. Here's how the questions will work. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can today. Please drop your questions in the Q&A box. Last week, we had over 400, close to 500 questions submitted. Our moderator today, Tara Smith, went through every one of those questions. We've read over them, organized them, sorted them, and picked the best ones and the most consistent ones. And most of today will be those questions. We will be folding in questions from the Q&A as well. We have a few members of the IRC's advisory board who will be answering questions rapid response style in the Q&A. They will not be able to get to all of them, but as many as we can get to, we will. And the ones that we don't get to today, should this be a worthwhile exercise for you all, we'll do another one of these and we'll pick up with the questions, the good questions, the best questions, the most common questions that didn't get asked today. So we're really lucky with the IRC. We not only have a wonderful group of restaurateurs involved, but we have really amazing outside consultants. We're going to start by introducing you to those folks. We have two PR firms that work with us. One is in the food world and one is in the political world. And I'm going to start by introducing you to the folks at Baltz, who handle the food side of PR for us. Phil, Sarah?
Hi guys, good morning. It's very nice to meet you virtually. My name is Philip Baltz. We run an agency for about 22 years, and our main focus has been working with independent restaurateurs across the country. Joining me on the call today are both Sarah Abel, who's an executive VP and partner in the firm who focuses on strategy and pitching, and also Casey Giltner, who works on all things digital and social for the agency. We're working closely with Precision to bring our deep and broad media contacts and industry connections to bear in our work with the IRC. And we're just very proud and excited to be part of this team because we think the voice that's being given to independent restaurants through the Independent Restaurant Coalition's work is vital. And we hope we can generate awareness and also bring about change that's much needed for the industry. And we're very passionate about it and grateful to be part of this.
We'll kick it over to our friends at Precision, Jeff and Lauren.
Hey there, my name is Jeff Solnit. I'm principal of Precision Strategies. So Precision joined this cause at the very beginning. We are an integrated marketing and campaign agency that was born out of the Obama campaign. Stephanie Cutter and Teddy Goff, who are both involved in this project, are partners of the firm, and they came together after the 2012 Obama race to try to apply some of the skills that we learned from the campaign to nonprofits and coalitions and companies around the world. So we have run a number of coalitions around different issues in the past, and are excited to be involved in this one. Our role in this project really is dealing with Beltway, Washington, D.C. Media, and finding strategic ways to drive the conversation in our key legislative targets around the country. So we work very closely with Thorn Run and Baltz to sort of leverage all those resources to make sure that can happen. And I'm going to kick it over to Lauren from our team to talk about what we're doing on our email campaign and on social media.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Alper. I'm also from Precision, and I work with the IRC on all things digital, so namely social media, video, website, email, and grassroots advocacy. We are focusing a lot of our effort on online engagement, especially during COVID-19. We want to make sure we reach as many people as possible. We want to make sure we educate people on what's going on in the restaurant industry. And we also really focus a lot on presenting simple and actionable ways for people to take action online. In addition, we're focused on providing resources that people can use. So you can check out our website for social media copy and graphics and even posters you can put in your restaurant windows. So we're just really trying to make sure that everyone knows what's going on and that we're getting you the latest on how you can take action. So definitely make sure to follow us online. Our Instagram and Twitter handles are both INDP Restaurants, and you can sign up for our email list on our website. And we'll make sure to get you the latest on how to take action and provide any updates we hear from the Hill. That's it for me. I will hand it back to Michael.
Thank you so much. Next, we're going to hear from one of our strategic advisors, Sam Cass, who many of you all know, as well as Chris Lamond, who is an advisor to us as well. Sam?
Hey, everybody. I don't own a restaurant, but I come from the world. I owe my entire life to the world, and I don't just sort of a little bit of background. Was the chef for President Obama and First Lady Michelle, and ran food policy for them, among a number of other things. So just been helping to put this together from the beginning, which was, this has all been a very fast moving situation with our entire industry in complete crisis. And so we put together, as this last bill was being passed, a team of some of the best on the Hill, and which you'll hear from, and Precision's like as good as it gets in Washington D.C. And so just know that you have some of the best in the game, fighting on behalf of everybody who's trying to make it through this rough time, and working very hard to make the fixes to the current piece of legislation, and getting what we need to get through this going forward. And so Chris and his team have been just unbelievably good at positioning us properly and getting us to the right people. And as you'll see, there's a political article, which is kind of like what everybody in DC reads, just out yesterday, which had listed the IRC next to the National Restaurant Association and a couple of the other big Goliaths of lobbying in Washington, D.C. And it's the fact that in just a few weeks we're being named among them is pretty impressive. So eager to dig in more deeply. I don't know, Shem Tuff, if that's what you wanted me to cover, but.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Over to you, Chris.
Good morning. Right. So our team at Thorn Run is managing the kind of the political outreach efforts with the incredible grassroots team that has been engaged as part of the IRC. It's been really impressive to watch and great to work with some of the restaurateurs around the country who've helped us in this effort, really get in front of the top leaders on the Hill and the administration. So while we are here to help on all things political and advise on grassroots engagement, we also have a team from Confluence Government Relations that's helping us actually lobby on the Hill. So we've got a whole team of folks that are working on this behalf. And I think to Sam's point, being mentioned in that article really shows how far we've come so fast.
Thank you, Chris. We have made a lot of noise given how new we are. That's something that's been brought up a lot. The fact that we're in that Politico article that Sam mentioned, I think listed next to NRA and Federation of Independent Businesses is incredible. So Sam and Chris and folks on our policy committee have talked at length about what the best path for us to move forward is. And we all think that while we're working on PPP fixes, which we'll get to in a minute, that the main focus for us needs to be on creating a stabilization fund. That is the thing that really has a chance to save our wider industry. And that's where our energy is being put now. So that's what we're going to talk about first. Then we're going to move on to talking about PPP. And then we'll talk about the IRC, talk quickly about business interruption, and then talk about rent and real estate negotiations. So jumping into the stabilization fund, a lot of questions that came up last week as we announced this, I want to hit first. So our policy was put together by a subcommittee of the IRC. Has about 20 people in it. It's the policy subcommittee. Jeannie and I chair it. We had a series of meetings over many weeks with, like I said, about 20 participants hashing out what a stabilization fund should ask for, what it should offer. So it was put together by the IRC. As we were in the process of putting our plan together, the NRA put their plan out, and their plan is a good one. It's a bold one. It's big. It's a grant, not a loan. We were talking about a roughly $100 billion fund. They asked for a $240 billion fund. So we made a strategic decision to essentially endorse their fund. That doesn't mean we endorse the NRA. That means we endorse their proposal in this specific idea, which is a grant. It would be run through the Treasury or through the IRS. And just to answer one question that came up a lot, it's a standalone bill. It's not tied to PPP. So we don't see anybody being excluded from stabilization if they participated in PPP. Another question that came up quite frequently is how did we get to 120 billion? So we've purchased research and looked at industry research that is available. And as best we can tell, 120 billion is enough to cover our part of the industry to the end of the year if we don't do any sales. So if we stay shut down, that 120 billion should make our part of the industry whole. We did have extensive conversations about who to include, who we're including and who we're not including in our ask. So our ask does include bars. We feel like there's a lot of similarities between bars and restaurants, and a lot of people in the IRC operate both. And most especially, we feel like bars are affected in much the same way by capacity restrictions and laws. So bars are included. Caterers are not specifically included in our ask. They would be included in the NRA. If we get this whole stabilization fund that the NRA has proposed, everybody's included, big, small. In the $120 billion ask that we have, all the small independents as well as bars are included. We are asking that $120 billion fund restrict groups that have more than 20 locations under the same name and businesses that are publicly traded. We believe there's enough funds in there to cover everybody else. So with that, Tara, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think that detailed exactly sort of the specifics of the IRC's ask. Sam, if you wouldn't mind delving in a little bit deeper about how our ask dovetails with the NRA's ask. Many folks knew that the letter was sent to the Small Business Administration late in April, and just sort of want to sort of flesh that out a little bit.
Yep.
Michael touched on it.
Yeah, so, what's been most important for us is that, this coalition represents small operators who oftentimes don't have a relationship with a bank, or, definitely don't have armies of accountants and lawyers to help them navigate how you access the funds. And so we, have set out to decide, figure out more or less what we think we need to keep everybody afloat through this, and then how to structure it in such a way that people who are most vulnerable to this crisis are the ones that are taken care of first. We have no problem. We know the entire restaurant industry is struggling. So in that regard, we support the broader asks for the industry, but both from a strategic standpoint and a need state. So meaning our needs are greater, and strategically, politically, there's not that much appetite to bail out giant corporations. And you saw in PPP, people on the Hill taking a lot of flack for big guys getting funds all across the board, where all these little operators of all industries, were cut out. And so we sort of positioned ourselves to be aligned, because in DC, you want to have as many people basically advocating for your interests as possible. So saying that we're aligned is important, at least for now. And that's just how more power means more chance you get something done. So picking fights, big and little, is not what we're about. We're about making sure that we get things done. And sometimes that just means pragmatic alliances. And so anybody who's, with us on that, we think is going to increase our odds of being successful. We're going to do what we have to do right now. But I think we have positioned ourselves in a really strong way. We account for about 60%. I think the last number I saw, obviously it's changing weekly, of job losses in terms of one industry, are a huge percentage. Correct, don't quote me on that number, but it's a huge percentage of job losses are coming from our industry. So there's big incentive for people to act. And we position ourselves in a way that I think it's hard to politically not support helping the small independent operators. And so I think we've been very thoughtful and incredibly strategic to both position ourselves and get our ass right. And so that's how we're approaching it. And we will see, how it all shakes out. We've tracked a middle ground. We're a reasonable ask. So I feel pretty good. I was saying this to somebody who was the first call that came in when it was like 10 people trying to figure out what to do. Just like, I don't know, it's like 6 weeks ago or something. It's crazy. We have done really everything there is that could be done. We put ourselves, we're in the game. We put ourselves in a strong position in DC. Everything is super hard right now. It's an unprecedented time, and it's unclear how this will play out. But there's nothing more. We're doing everything there is to do, and we put ourselves in as strong a position as I could have ever dreamed. I mean, I never would have thought we would be quite this in this position this quickly. So I'm feeling optimistic, very cautiously, that we're going to be able to influence how this comes out in a way that will help people in a pretty significant way.
Thank you so much, Sam. Jeannie, do you mind delving a little deeper into how our ask, the IRC's ask, will really protect small independent restaurants, sole proprietors, true small businesses with maybe under 20 employees? There was some concern that restaurants of this type would get lost in a crowd of restaurant groups that have under 20 standalone restaurants.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that kind of to echo a little bit what Sam said, is that it's really important to us that we not be divisive in this. Like, we feel that we, with the numbers that we had from the IBIS report, the 120 billion does cover all independent restaurants. So those are people that aren't chains or franchises or publicly traded companies. We all know how labor intensive restaurants are. So I have a friend that runs 3 services. He has over 50 employees, but he works the line every single night. So it's hard to say that he's not an independent restaurateur. And if you have less than 5 employees, you are, a sole independent operator. That said, in our letter, we do call out this whole stabilization carve out is about access. And so we do ask Congress to prioritize underrepresented communities. Specifically, we call out minorities and women, but we definitely do feel that that is an ask of Congress to really focus on the small operators. Putting a number on it is a little challenging for us, but that's our approach, and we're asking the legislators then to figure out what that process should be in order to prioritize those folks.
Thank you so much. Chris, if you wouldn't mind jumping in to explain a little bit more about how the IRC is lobbying for their stabilization fund ask. Specifically, folks were interested in what are the difficulties in maybe getting something like this passed, and how are we aligning with maybe other small suppliers to lobby?
Sure. Thank you. I'll try to hit those one by one. So I initially started out talking about the grassroots community that we've built, and want to go back to that because it's really strong. We've armed the IRC members with letters, with talking points, with one-pagers, with graphics that help them communicate the outline of the stabilization fund. directly to the Hill and to the administration. And the IRC has responded. Like I mentioned earlier, we've, from Speaker Pelosi to Mitch McConnell to Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, and all up and down rank and file members in the House and the Senate, both Republican and Democrat. We've really aggressively reached out to every corner of the Hill. And in fact, I know of at least 3 calls happening right now with either senators or members of the House to advocate on behalf of the stabilization fund. So we've really, started this as a campaign to gather as much data and information that we can to support our request. We've got a very strong story to tell. And one of the conversations that someone reported having with a Republican senator from the South earlier this week said, this seems to me to be like the quickest way we can get 11 million people back to work. And that's one of the messages that we've led with, is that this fund will immediately allow us to put that workforce that's out of work right now back on our payrolls and get the economy kickstarted again. So that's how we've been approaching this, again, from a grassroots perspective, trying to get as many of our vast supporters and leaders in the community to reach out to the Hill, and the IRC members have responded in full force. It's been great to see. With that grassroots support, we have to, match it up with what's doable on the Hill. This is not going to be an easy request to get approved, but I can tell you that we have a large number of members and senators who understand our problem and want to help out. So we're going to have to get over a couple issues. There is a real concern on the Republican side that we spent too much money already, that we have really put ourselves in a difficult position fiscally to continue this type of spending. That's one area we'll have to get over. The second is the idea that this is a bailout versus the way that they've done this in the past, which is kind of loan and forgive that loan. The path that PPP took. But again, we've had good conversations with members, and this is the time to ask for something big, right? So they've done a lot for a lot of industries. They've tried to throw a lot of money at the problem. And, given the support from members of the Congress that we've received, it makes sense for us to put this big ask together and take our shot at it. We're not quite sure how it will end up. There are other proposals out there to bolster small businesses, and we support those, but really are leading with the effort of getting the stabilization fund passed and signed into law, so we can access additional funds to keep our doors open when we're allowed to open. It's not just us working for this. We've really worked hard to, again, engage that supply chain that we work with. So working with the wine and spirits distributors, or produce manufacturers, or cattlemen's associations, or fish suppliers. So all the organizations that support the restaurant industry, we've reached out to. We'd love your help in that effort to engage a conversation with contacts you may have in the industry, whether it's linens to food suppliers to whatever. It really is important that we try to get as many organizations to support what we're trying to do as we can. We've got a letter that we've written that we'll ask people to sign that will accompany our messages on the Hill to make sure that they understand the impact that the supply chain has and the amount of organizations that support what we're trying to do. So that's kind of who we've tried to partner with. We're trying to get as many organizations behind our effort, in addition to our local members of Congress and senators, to really engage how we write this legislation and how we get it passed. So that's kind of where we are right now. And I think we can look to the next couple weeks as very important time for this effort. The Senate is in session this week. The House is coming back next week. It is expected that Speaker Pelosi will move first to introduce legislation that will form the foundation for the next phase of stimulus funding. That is the target that we're shooting for, to get language around our stabilization fund included in that package. That will set up a negotiation with the Senate, between the Senate, the administration, and the House, the same way it's worked the first 4 packages, if you will, to negotiate and to work in that parallel track that Michael talked about with the stabilization fund and the fixes to PPP that we need. So I think timing is critical, and we've got 2, maybe 3 weeks of really a lot of activity that we foresee if we're going to be successful.
Chris, just 2 things. Is there anyone that we are specifically partnering with on the Hill or in Congress to craft the legislation? You mentioned Pelosi. And then if this is approved, how soon do you think the fund would come about? I know you're mentioning times and when Congress is coming back to session, but maybe everything is theoretical at this point, we understand, but anything you can provide or illuminate around that would be helpful.
Sure. So, we are working with as many members as we can. There are key leaders that have propped up that support what we're doing. We're really targeting right now some Senate Republicans, to be honest. We've got some good conversations with some offices that support what we're doing, but we need more. We've had, everybody that needs to have this letter on the Hill has it. Everybody in the administration that needs to have this letter has it, requesting this fund. So we're working with as many members as we can to try to get specific champions to endorse the idea and to move it forward with Speaker Pelosi and Senator McConnell. So that's been our singular focus of the last 2 weeks, and will continue over the next 2 weeks as we try to build as much support as we can for the fund. And that includes, like I said, working with industry partners as best we can to make sure that the folks in the Hill understand the vast support for the restaurant industry that exists.
Thank you so much, Chris. He mentioned a couple of ways of lobbying for the stabilization fund in terms of partner industries, lobbying for yourself. So if you are looking for ways to get involved, calling and emailing your representatives and using the IRC letter, which is on our website, is a great place to start. Michael, I'm going to hand it back to you before we jump into discussions on what we are doing as an organization around the Payment Protection Program.
Thank you so much, Tara. Thank you, Chris. Chris will be back in a few minutes to talk about what we're doing to lobby for fixes to the PPP. But I am very pleased to introduce Caroline Stein, a wonderful restaurateur from Los Angeles and a member of the IRC Advisory Board, who will serve as your peer expert on PPP, and Jim Joseph with Arnold Porter, one of the leading law firms in the country, if not the world, who's been very generous in dedicating his time and giving his time to the IRC to help us answer PPP-related questions. Jim has a noon appointment, so we're going to ask you to direct all your questions that you have for Jim. Once again, is an attorney who's closely studied PPP. So please direct your questions to him early, as he's got it out in about 30 minutes. Tara, I'm going to kick it back to you for questions.
Absolutely. Jim, if you wouldn't mind just diving right into sort of technical tips for applying for PPP. Most specifically, folks were very interested in how they calculate full-time equivalency. I'm going to lead you there and then give you some more right after.
Great, thanks. Thank you for having me. Great, a softball. So they are building this program while it's in the air at this point, and they're releasing guidance periodically. They have not told us how to calculate full-time equivalent employees. And this is on the loan forgiveness side. That's where it's relevant. So there are a number of different ways that would be reasonable. 30 hours a week are used by some of the ERISA, employee benefit issues. 40 hours a week are used by others. I think our expectation is that the SBA is going to come out with guidance and clarify this point soon. We had expected it last week and it hasn't come out yet. And I think the key is if we don't have guidance by the time you are applying for forgiveness, you just have to be very clear in your application which one that you've used, and our idea is that 30 hours per week or 40 hours per week is probably going to be the most likely.
I have a question from the chat for you regarding full-time equivalent. If I got my PPP, what if I pay 2 employees for the first 5 weeks and then the rest for the last 3 weeks? Will that affect my average of FTE at the end of the loan?
It will, because the FTE is measured, you divide the 8 weeks into 2 monthly periods and then average them together. So, sorry, I didn't write down the math, but if you had sort of 2 in the beginning and then 5 at the end, you would, that would equal 3.5 full-time people. But if you are employing 5 people as of June 30, then you don't reduce your employee headcount. You get counted for those purposes as having 5, because there's an exception. You reduce your loan forgiveness if your headcount drops from the prior quarter, from the first quarter of 2020, but if you rehire by June 30, then you ignore that reduction completely.
Thank you so much.
Important thing to remember.
How do you deal with tipped employees when it comes to PPP?
Tips are included in wages. So, when you're calculating your loan for how much loan you can get, you look at the prior period, prior 12 months or 2019, and you include tips in there. And that should be the tip amount that you included in on W-2s. We have been asked by some, we're also providing pro bono services for small restaurant owners. We have about 70 lawyers working on that program. So people should be aware of that too. We've been asked what happens if we did tips off the books and we didn't report that. Not that anyone on this call would ever do that, but if you did, you can't include it because they're going to look to your W-2 income and your 940 and your 941s. For the sort of loan forgiveness, you can pay people and you can calculate an assumed tip amount. So you kind of estimate what your tips would be based on prior, kind of based on the prior history. So you can do an estimate and include that.
Thank you for that clarification. For owners who typically receive K-1 distributions, can they go on payroll and receive PPP funds?
Maybe. So there are generally two types of K-1 income. The least likely would be if you have an S corporation. So K-1s are issued to owners of S corporations and partnerships. If you have an S corporation and you got K-1 income and you did not get W-2 income, because an S corp you can get both. If you got K-1 income, then you can't include that. If you are a partnership, which is the much more likely, you're an LLC taxed as a partnership, then you can, and there's a box on your K-1 that gets included in your self-employment. I think it's either box 14 or box 19. I apologize, I'm forgetting. But that does get included as wages in your PPP calculation. So you can, and if you're getting distributions during the 8-week period, you should make sure that you're paying yourself during the 8-week period so that you can count that amount towards your loan forgiveness.
Thank you. Can a business hire someone to work at more than one restaurant under PPP?
The answer is yes. So if you got a PPP loan if you got loans for your 3 locations and they're separate, and you have an employee working, sort of 15 hours or 20 hours a week at each of them, and they're being paid by each location, then they can, you would just count them 20 hours at the one restaurant, 20 hours at the other, and 20 hours at the third. I know on the last call we had a question about what happens if I have restaurant A that's paying the person full time, but if they don't have full-time work there, I'm basically letting them work at the other restaurants, too. I think their full salary, the full salary would be counted for restaurant A, even though they might be performing services for restaurant B and C. So whoever is giving them the paycheck, who's ever going to issue the W-2 to them, that's the one that should count them for PPP purposes.
Thank you. In terms of also hiring, can folks that have gotten PPP hire freelancers such as photographers or graphic designers or maybe even repair people and put them on payroll?
You can. I mean, usually, the test is people want to hire them not as employees, but as you should be, hiring them and treating them as employees. So, especially repair people, if you're going to do a long, like a set of repairs and they don't have a company, you're hiring individuals and you're going to have to issue them W-2s and do withholding taxes and all of that. That probably is okay. I have some questions whether the IRS and the SBA are going to look behind that, because usually they want you to treat people as employees and not independent contractors. But, if you have a photographer who's going to come in and work for a couple of hours or a day doing some things and you just try and get them in on the W-2 thing, I don't think that would work. But if you're going to have someone who's going to be coming in and doing an individual, doing some big scale project that might last for weeks and weeks, it's a little more defensible.
Absolutely. And the reason I ask that is, hypothetically, what if you can't spend anywhere near the full employment requirement with the labor expenses? So in this case, is the amount forgiven proportionate? So maybe you're looking for other ways to spend that money. So if you got 75,000, but the full employment should total 100,000, do I get the 75,000 forgiven if I can't meet the requirement of employment?
I think I understand the question. So there are 3 requirements in calculating the forgiveness. If you got $100 PPP loan, if you wanted to get full forgiveness, you'd have to spend at least $75 on payroll costs. And then now you could spend $100 on payroll costs and that would be fine, but it has to be at least 75. And then 25 on other stuff, which would be rent, mortgage, utilities.
Yes, I'm sorry. I think I confused you because I didn't word that very clearly. So say you got the 100 and 75 is meant for your payroll, right? For it to be forgiven, but you can't reach that, or you haven't found a creative solution, but you reach $50 that you're able to put towards payroll. Would that $50 be forgiven? Or because you're not able to reach the 75% requirement, does that become a loan?
Yeah, the 50 would be forgiven, and then you could calculate whatever sort of the 25% of a total. Then you would figure out 50 is 75% of what, and you're not going to want me to do math on the spot here. So if that's like $62 or something, then you could also get $12 of rent, utilities, and other things, just so that 50 is 75% of the total, or 100% of the total.
If I'm understanding you correctly, the portion that you're able to spend on payroll, right? Even if it doesn't equal the 75%, that portion will be forgiven.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I think that answers the question. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Sorry about that.
No, I think that was all my fault. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about the employer retention tax credit and how that might work in tandem with the PPP.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I do want to go back to the last question.
All right, yes.
1 minute, because the forgiveness amount does get reduced if you don't hit the head count total, and if you've reduced salaries of people who are still employed. So you do have to look at those two to make sure that the $50 in your example is still getting fully forgiven.
If you have any other more detailed questions about that, please put that in the chat, because I think that is a little nebulous.
Yeah.
Can we move on while we're waiting for those other questions to the employer retention tax credit and how that works with PPP?
Right. So let me just think, because I'm blanking for a minute on because a couple of them you can't take advantage of if you're doing, so the employer retention tax credit, I'm going to have to double check. I just don't remember.
Sure, yeah, thank you so much. While not that needs to be answered now, that can be for a later day or a later town hall should folks find these helpful. Could you maybe talk a little bit about a raise in manager's salary during the PPP, if that's acceptable?
Yep, that is fine. And, it has to still be, the compensation still has to be reasonable, but, it's very unusual that restaurant salaries are anywhere close to unreasonable. So you get a lot of room. And, there's hazard pay, there's lots of other reasons why it's completely appropriate to increase salaries.
Absolutely. And then, Chris, you might also want to jump in on this. We have a question regarding forgiveness if a person refuses to take their job back. Given that we are in the middle of a pandemic and stay-at-home orders are still a moving target, will the employee, be affected, like their unemployment benefits in terms of eligibility?
So there are two things about if an employee refuses to come back. One is we got guidance on Sunday night from the SBA and Treasury that you don't have to include that person in your head count for loan reduction purposes. So if they worked before and they don't work anymore, you can just take them out of the numerator and the denominator. So it's not going to reduce your PPP, which is good news and unexpected. It will impact, the unemployment is all state-based, so it will vary by states. Some states might be varying this requirement, but I don't know of any that have. Generally, you have to certify on a weekly or bi-weekly basis that you're out there looking for a job and you haven't gotten a job. So if someone offered you a job and you turned it down, you would then no longer qualify for unemployment unless they've put in some exception for these purposes in the vast majority of states.
Whew, that's heavy. Can you talk a little bit about payroll expenses and how long they have to be spent given forgiveness, and specifically the fact that do they have to be spent within the 8 weeks to get the forgiveness, since we were getting up to like the 2.5 times of average payroll?
Right. So it does. It has to be spent within the 8 weeks. And, the 8 weeks is measured from the day you get the loan to, kind of 8 weeks later. And there has been a lot of discussion that the 8-week period doesn't work. And, in particular, it's very difficult for restaurants that are shut down and are unlikely to reopen during that 8-week period. There is a lot of pressure, a lot of discussion on the Hill that 8-week period should be expanded, but there's also quite a bit of resistance to that from the Treasury Department and others. So you can't assume it's going to change. So you do have to spend it during the 8 weeks. One thing that's a little unclear is, you have a payroll cycle. So if you pay on the 15th and the 30th of every month, and your 8-week period ends, June 28th, is that June 30th payroll run going to be included, or most of it, in your period? They haven't given us guidance about that, but what we think the answer is going to be is that you will be able to use your normal payroll and just include payment for any services provided during that 8-week period. It does say that you have to have, accrued it and paid it during the 8 weeks. But if you have a payroll provider or something, they won't just change your payroll period and accelerate it by 2 days. So we and many others have told the SBA this and have asked for clarification. And that's something that we hope will get clarified in the next day or two. But that's what we're thinking the answer is going to be. And that's what we've suggested the answer should be.
Okay, I'm not going to let you go quite yet. You're quite popular.
Oh, that's fine. I got time.
Is there a number of employees is the number of employees more important, or the dollar amount?
So again, since there are 3 elements to the test, the dollar amount is the most important in calculating the initial loan forgiveness. As we said in our example, if you had $75 in payroll costs and that would, help you maybe get full forgiveness, 50 you would get less. So, and that sort of controls everything. But you can't ignore the head count, because if your head count drops, then your loan forgiveness amount is going to be proportionately reduced. So you do have to keep your eye on both. If I had to pick which one is more important, you want to start with the highest number possible. So the payroll costs, I think, are probably most important, but I think you should run the scenarios, do the math on the different ways. And I know, I've talked to Caroline, I've talked to lots of others on the phone, and they're running all these different approaches to see, okay, which is the way that I'm going to be able to get the most benefit out of this.
Absolutely. Can you prepay rent as part of your PPP and have it forgiven?
No, is my view. And I think this is the commonly held view, because it's supposed to be for amounts paid and incurred. And so advanced rent wouldn't count sort of for that.
Okay, thank you. That's kind of a bummer.
I know. It's just, I should start every answer with this. It's like, I'm sorry, I didn't make the rule.
You didn't, but we appreciate the clarification on the rules. We all want this to be forgiven when the time comes, so we really appreciate you going down into the nitty-gritty here with us. I've received my funding last week. I paid April and May lease plus the utilities, and I was behind on since closure. Will this be covered under my 25%? The lease and utilities were up to date at closure.
Sure. Okay. And so they were pre-8-week coverage. They were from
April and May. I guess. Yeah. That's the information I have currently.
Okay. All right. So the May rent, if they got the money last week, certainly the May rent will be included because that's, within the 8 weeks because it starts the day you get funding. The rent that you paid, see, this is where the date paid is a little unclear, because if I paid my April rent, I got my money May 1st and I paid my April and May rent on May 2nd. Under one reading of the rule, they would both count because it was paid during the 8-week period. And you had already incurred the expense. So it's not like paying future rent. So that I think is defensible. We think that they may clarify that and say that you may only be able to cover the May rent. So that's something you need to keep track of and see if guidance comes out. And if guidance doesn't come out when you're doing the loan forgiveness application, and this is important for any of these issues that are still unclear, you want to make sure you clearly disclose it on your loan forgiveness application. Because these applications are signed under penalties of perjury and fraud. And as we heard the other day, the first group that has been audited and been charged with fraud was a fraudulent restaurant that applied for PPP. In Rhode Island, charges were brought, 2 days ago. So 2 men applied for a PPP loan together, saying they owned a restaurant with 1 location in Rhode Island, 1 location in Massachusetts. I don't know if they just didn't even own restaurants, but they certainly didn't employ the number of people they said and everything else, and they've been indicted. So those are the first PPP indictments. So you want to be clear on the form that, you know, we included rent for April and May because we paid it in May during the 8-week period. If they then approve your your loan forgiveness for that amount, you haven't hidden the ball. So you're on safer ground if you have an unclear question. So hopefully that's helpful.
Is this a moment where you might check with your bank? I know that being in touch with your lender is super, super vital. I kind of cleared that with my lender ahead of time, with the caveat, of course, that they're waiting for more guidance. But
yes, and I should say one of the things, you know, we are representing 3 or 4 banks, and so when the banks get questions like that, they call us. And you know what we're saying to them right now is, under current guidance, we think the April rent and the May rent would be okay, but wait for more guidance. So but yeah, talking to your banker is important because, you know, they're seeing a lot of these. And so I think they will be helpful and they have access then to their lawyers as well who can help you decide.
Jim, I want to be cognizant of your time. We have 5 more minutes of you. I have one question for you, and then Caroline, I'd love for you to jump in to answer one with your expertise. So if I wasn't paid as an owner before, can I pay myself with a W-2 and K-1 now, Jim?
So if you are an owner and you have a partnership, so you were getting a K-1 and you were taking it all as profits, you can't take W-2 income now, but you can take K-1 income that would be subject to self-employment, which counts as wages. So that, you know, box 14 or 19 income, you can switch over now as long as you're actively working in the business. You know, that's the requirement. If you're actively working in the business and you're an owner, you can pay yourself something that's subject to self-employment wages, and that gets counted as payroll costs.
Thank you so much. Caroline, and I think maybe Michael might also want to chime in on this one. What are your thoughts on whether you should wait to use the PP funds in hopes of the origination date changing?
you know, in my opinion, it seems like the likelihood of the origination date changing, it does not seem possible in my mind. There's so many people have already gotten these loans, and so actually I'm a good example of this. I got multiple loans for various restaurants. I'm using them for 3 of them, and for 1 of them I am kind of waiting and hoping to see if there is origination date change, and if not, I probably won't use that loan, or I will use that loan not expecting to get forgiveness. In my opinion, for restaurants, especially now that we're closed, a lot of us aren't going to be able to open until, who knows, June, July. The only way to make this loan work for you is to get full forgiveness. And it is a matrix of numbers that you need to put together to get those, everything we've been talking about. But the minute I got my loan, I knew that I wanted to get full forgiveness. So I got people hired immediately. Anybody who didn't want to come back on payroll, I replaced them already, because that guidance about potentially reducing your forgiveness or not reducing your forgiveness based on people who reject the employment offer wasn't on the table at that point, and I just decided go full force so that I have my full-time equivalent head counts from the beginning for the 8 weeks, and I'm reaching over that 75% for the payroll. I think if you're getting the loan and you've made the decision to use it, then get going on it immediately. But for each case, it's different. I spoke with a restaurant PR firm yesterday that we went through her different options, and for her, the best thing was to not worry about the full forgiveness and to use it for payroll going into multiple months, just over the 8 weeks, because for her, taking on the debt of the amount that will not be forgiven was worth it for her to keep her employees on payroll for a longer period.
So Caroline, so on that note, question for Jim. I know he's got to run here in a minute. Can people just refi their PPP loan into a traditional banknote? Assuming they can, is there anything limiting them for using it for whatever purpose they want and refining it?
So you could sort of refinance the PPP and pay the money back, sort of pay the PPP money back. But you also remember, if the PPP is a loan, so if it's not forgiven, you have 2 years to pay it back at a 1% interest rate. So, for some businesses that might make sense. You still have to use 75% of the PPP for payroll costs over the 2 years. But, again, that still might make sense for you if you think you're going to be open in September, and you would then be able to use it at that point and, kind of pay it back with that 1% interest rate, which, is a low interest rate, which you might not be able to get if you were refinancing somewhere else. You're not going to get something that low.
Jim, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and appreciate all the time of the 70 attorneys that you mentioned that your firm are working pro bono on this. Is there an upcoming webinar that's scheduled through you and the Beard Foundation that people can get more information?
We're trying to schedule it now. So, we'll see if we can get it scheduled maybe for Friday or kind of early next week. And really, we were kind of waiting for the loan forgiveness guidance to come out so I could actually answer more questions than say maybe. But, we'll let you know as soon as we can schedule something.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. You're of course welcome to stay on, but we understand you have to jump off. And thank you also.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be helping you. As I've said before, when we get out of this mess, if restaurants don't reopen, life is not going to be worth living. So this is why I'm sort of thrilled to be helping you guys.
Thank you
so much. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
And thank you to the Beard Foundation, which has facilitated Arnold Porter being available through pro bono time that they had. So big thanks to the Beard Foundation for making Jim and others available. Really a wonderful thing. And they've been involved, and we'll hear from Mitchell with the Beard Foundation shortly.
Awesome. So we are going to jump into, and I know this is sort of maybe doing it a little bit backwards, but we would love to hear from both Chris and Caroline about really what the purpose of PPP was, what our lobbying efforts and the IRC have been, because they have been in tandem with the PPP was our first lobbying effort, and then we've moved into the stabilization fund. And then what are some best practices? Caroline, you started to jump into that, and I know that's immensely helpful. So if you are having questions, like if you have gotten your PPP and are not sure about what to do, please continue to put those questions in the chat and we will get to them. Chris, if you could start just with explaining how and why the purpose of the PPP was. There is, it's kind of confusing. Like it's essentially to put people back to work, but if there's no work to be done, how does that all fit for restaurants?
Yeah, it doesn't, unfortunately. And the intent of the PPP program was, and this is from talking with a number of members and staff on the Hill, the intent of the program was to have employers pay employees during an 8-week period that would be at the longest point 8 weeks of closure, right? I think at the beginning when they wrote this legislation in March, the thought was that, okay, we're going to have to do, you know, a 2-week shutdown, maybe 4 weeks. But after that, we're going to be able to open up and all will be well. So that was where the mindset was in mid-March when they created the PPP. Clearly, they weren't correct. And the PPP doesn't work primarily for businesses like ours who are prohibited from state mandates from opening, or at least opening on a much smaller platform in terms of just takeout. So, and then that is why we've been focused specifically on our lobbying efforts with our grassroots team to change some of the PPP provisions to allow flexibility around that start date. So 8 weeks could work if we could start it when we're allowed to open up our doors by our state. So if we had that flexibility, that would allow the PPP program to work for us, but we don't have that right now. We're also advocating for extending out that 8-week period beyond that 8 weeks to maybe 12 or 16 weeks, where we could have a little bit of additional backstop. So when we open, we know with social distancing, and I understand some states are requiring a maximum of 25% capacity in the bottom end, and maybe even 50% at the top end. So when we open up, we know we're not going to be at full capacity like barbershops are. So when you open up a barbershop on the first day you're allowed to open up, you can expect a line at the door. But we probably can't see that same return on the restaurants for a variety of different reasons. And that has led our efforts on the Hill to make sure that they understand that. And I think, let me add kind of parenthetically, I do have some confidence that we're going to get some changes to PPP. There are a large number of members introducing bills, writing letters to the SBA and to the Treasury Department on all of these issues, from origination date to extending it out beyond 8 weeks, to things like increasing the term from 2 years back to the original 10 years, and pushing the SBA for more forgiving guidance on how forgiveness will work. So there are a large number of small business organizations from, and that political article mentioned us with the NFIB and NRA and IRC and all the other U.S. chambers and all the local chambers around the country that are having these same issues. I think our next stimulus package will include some of these fixes. The big question is, how does it work when you've already started your 8-week period? And we don't have an answer to that today, but we can tell you that that has also been part of our messaging to the Hill, and that they need to understand that, when this program first opened, we were scared to death it would run out of money, so everybody wanted to get in line. They've refilled the pot to the tune of $350 billion more. That may run out again in the next couple of days. So that created a big rush of everybody to start their loan processing and get that 8 weeks underway. So having some explanation in legislative statute, and not even leaving it open to guidance from the SBA or Treasury, is a real priority for us. Again, on that concurrent track with the Stabilization Fund one track and these PPP changes on another. That's a real priority for us. And members that we've talked to understand that, and I feel really good that the leaders like Nydia Velázquez on the Democratic side in the House, Tim Scott on the Senate side, and Republicans, and a handful of others that have written these letters to Treasury and the SBA understand that, and we'll address that in the new legislation. The hope is that it allows some accommodation for folks who've already started their 8 weeks.
Sorry, I didn't mean to throw in I don't think that's going to happen. For me, as an operator, you're stuck gambling. So I tend to be conservative, and I tend to be the rule follower, and I just want to get it done correctly.
No, I think that's smart to do it that way, because you don't want to fail this forgiveness test with rules that we don't know how to follow, and that's the unfortunate part about all this. But I just know from communications that have come out of the Hill that this is a real priority for them. And when you see bipartisan members get together and push on the same issues, and you see leaders like Speaker Pelosi, even as early as this morning, talking about real need to improve the PPP in this next package, that gives me hope at least that we can get some of these fixes that we've been advocating for on behalf of the IRC included in that final package, or next package, not final.
Just to recap that in sort of more Tara speak, that means that that we at the IRC are focusing on many of the points that lots of folks asked about last week. The forgiveness guidelines, the forgiveness timeline, the revising of the 8-week period. Does that have anything to do with stay-at-home orders? When is the start time of the loan? Why is it 2-year payback now rather than 10? And can we eventually maybe use this money to pay suppliers? We don't have any control over what changes will happen, but what we do know is that we're advocating for the changes that all of you are also concerned about. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clearly understood. Chris, I have one more question for you, and then people cannot wait to hear from you, Caroline, since you are dealing with this on the ground. Can you talk about PPP non-recourse language? I have heard restaurateurs talking about not paying it back since there is a non-recourse clause and no guarantees.
Well, so there is a guarantee from the federal government to your lender that this loan will be accommodated. There's no personal guarantee on your side. Help me understand a little bit more what you're trying to get to, though, the question you're trying to answer.
It seems to me that people are wondering, so if they don't pay it back, what's the problem? They're not gonna come after me and, you know, take my car and my home.
It's not personally guaranteed by us.
But I think there are other consequences if you don't pay the loan back, correct? No?
Yes. I mean, it is a loan that, you know, if not paid back, will certainly impact your credit rating. That's
we
for
just
sure.
heard from Jim about audits happening already, right?
Yeah.
So we've heard that like it's not just a blank check and that people will be looking at what you're doing with the money. So I think take with that what you will, and operate with however you feel comfortable.
And know that you do have to spend the money on payroll, rent, and utilities. It can't be spent on anything else. A lot of people I know think that they can use it for operating expenses, and you can't. So that's very important because that's another aspect of fraud.
Absolutely. Caroline, it is now to you. I would love to know a little bit more about exactly what you're doing with money. Are you actually paying people to not work, or are you asking them to work for free?
No, never asking anybody to work for free. Don't ever do that. It'll never be found in your favor to do that. We are actually paying people full-time, even if they're not working full-time. Before we got our loans, we actually weren't operating at all. We were closed. We were concerned about exposing people to the virus. We were unsure about what to do. And we actually thought for us, let's just stop the bleeding and stop operating and freeze. And when we got the loan, we decided that particularly for one of our restaurants, it made sense for us to use it to bring back as many people as possible that would agree to come back, put them on payroll. If for those people that said no, we replaced them with other people to get all of our full-time equivalent headcounts back up. And we're doing a little bit of to-go to take advantage of this moment when we have employees, but a lot of them are working 5 hours, maybe 10 hours, some none. Our managers are working a lot, but it made sense for us to do that because remember, you do get at least 2 months of rent paid. You do get your state taxes and health insurance benefits covered. And so for us, we had kept on a few employees to help us through our downtime. And so it's helping us pay them. These are expenses that would have been coming out of our pocket. And although there are expenses that you do incur because of this, the net win for us made sense. There's just this important thing that people forget, that you are going to be accountable for federal taxes. So you are incurring that, 7.5% on top of the payroll costs. So that part is not forgiven. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your calculations. That's a really important aspect of it. For one of our businesses, we're a bakery and we were already operating, although at very, very reduced capacity. So this allowed us to bring all of our employees back on, and we're rotating shifts around. But I ran this by my bank also. I'm a big, big proponent of talking to your banker, having them key in and weigh in on all of your decisions to say yes, because they're going to be the ones who are going to bat for you about your forgiveness. So they said, yes, you're going to pay people to work when they're not working. And there are also ways you can give them a bonus or a bump in their hourly wage to make it up to the people who are working. But yes, you will be paying people not to work.
Or at least reduced amount of work.
Or reduced.
So I would like to make sure that everyone knows that the Q&A is where you should be putting your questions, because that will make sure they get to me. So put them in the Q&A so I make sure that I can ask all of our awesome experts here and peers the questions that you have. And I'm just mentioning that because the Q&A is different than the chat. So make sure you're using the Q&A, please. So last week, a lot of people were curious, like, should they just give the PPP back since there are all these strings attached to it? What are your thoughts on that?
You know, again, it's really case by case. If you're not operating and you're not generating any income and you don't have any payroll expenses, at that point, for me, if that was me, I would say I'm not going to use that loan, because then I'm just going to bring people on, pay them, and incur that federal tax burden, which I can't afford to do. But also remember, it is a 1% loan. If you decide that you can't use it now, but you can use it once you do open for payroll, then you may decide, you know what, I'm going to keep the money and have it there. And if I need to use it for payroll, once I do get open, I will do that. I may not get forgiveness on it, but it will be payable at a 1% rate over 2 years. I think the question comes up a lot about why would you want to refinance a 1% loan? But I think all of us in the restaurant industry know that sometimes our margins are so thin that you can't afford a big loan payment. And paying something over 2 years, that loan payment could be pretty significant. So if you could refinance it and get a lower rate, get a rate and pay it over a longer period of time, that would be great. And I know the IRC is fighting for, you know, extending that 2-year payback time back to the 10 years that originally was determined to be. But
yeah. It's tricky. So I do want to I'm going to kind of cut the discussion on PPP short here, because there are so many questions. We're probably going to end up doing something specific to PPP. So I know, and I just want to put this out there, you don't need to answer this question. There are a lot of questions around enticing folks to come back to work off unemployment. And we will hit that in our next, the next time I get to hang out with all of you. I do want to thank you so much. Your experience is just, you're doing it on the ground right now, and we just thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I'm going to ask Michael to talk a little bit about business insurance interruption. This was a question we got a lot last week about what is the IRC doing in regards to that, especially with our lobbying efforts.
Great. Thank you so much, Tara. As Tara mentioned, a few people on the advisory board of IRC have messaged us and said, hey, we need to do a whole separate PPP. So we see most of the questions are about PPP. We'll work on providing another seminar, ideally with somebody from on reporter. And again, so we'll be back. I do want to mention that the purpose of IRC and the reason why we organize is to advocate on your behalf in Congress. This sort of education, peer-to-peer education, is secondary to our primary purpose. So I know some people have asked me about why aren't we putting out more white papers? Why aren't we giving more advice to restaurateurs about how to reset and improve their margins and things like that? And all that is things that are interesting to a lot of us who are in the IRC, but I just wanted to say our goal is to lobby and advocate for policy on your behalf in Congress. So with that in mind, last week, there were several questions asked about business interruption insurance, and this week, a few more. So I just want to speak to that quickly. So the IRC is generally supportive of the fight to get insurance companies to pay BI insurance, but it is not one that we're engaging in. And the reason is probably threefold. One, we think we need to be laser focused on PPP fixes and stabilization fund. 2, we think the BI, business interruption fight, is going to take a long time to play out in the courts. And 3, and probably most importantly, there are players already fighting this fight, including the big group, wearebig.org, I think is that address. So we are supportive of their efforts, but we are not engaged in spending our resources fighting that fight. So I just wanted to clarify that for everyone. Next, we're going to pivot to a discussion of the IRC. And I'm pleased to welcome my friend Mitchell Davis, the Chief Strategy Officer of the Beard Foundation, for this part. So we took the questions that were asked last week and questions today about the IRC and who the IRC is advocating for. So please feel free to submit your questions about IRC here. So I guess, you know, we've been working on exactly figuring out what the group that we are representing are, and it's something that we've asked Mitchell to help us work through. Sometimes it's easier to know what you're not. So a few things that I can tell you that we're not advocating for is we're not advocating for franchises or franchisees. We do think that this is an industry-wide issue. It's affecting businesses of all sizes, but the IRC is here to advocate for independence. I understand franchisees are individually owned and operated. I actually happen to own a few franchises myself, so I think I uniquely understand what resources franchises have versus independent restaurants, and they're just fundamentally different, and that's why we've taken the position that we are lobbying on behalf of independence. Again, for us, in terms of stabilization fund, that doesn't mean that we're going to define an independent restaurant as this, but for the purpose of the stabilization fund request, we have defined our 120 billion carve out as non-publicly traded companies with fewer than 20 of the same location. We do realize that that includes businesses of all kinds. I mean, businesses of various sizes, but that's what we're advocating on the stabilization fund. Mitchell, will you talk a bit about both the work that we're doing to define who we are as a coalition, as well as how the Beard Foundation has interfaced with IRC since the start?
Sure, thanks, Michael. This has been such a useful experience, both the town hall, but also the IRC's coalescence around these key lobby issues. And let me start by saying, for those folks looking for some deeper industry education, that's in fact one of the major pivots the Beard Foundation has undergone in this crazy time that we're in. And when we were looking around for the way to be most useful, as soon as it was very clear that COVID was going to have an outsized impact on the restaurant industry, it was expressly to provide resources as tactical as you know, what's a proper level of sanitation for delivery, and or how do I advocate, how do I even talk to my local representatives? And those are things that we've been doing as an organization for a long time, but we've just doubled down on that. And I think it helps in talking about what the coalition for the IRC is. It may help for some to understand that there are some very clear rules, laws, in fact, about what certain organizations with different types of status can do and what they can't do, how they can spend their money, how they can raise their money. We don't need to get into the technicalities of it, but the Beard Foundation is what's called a 501c3. It's a type of nonprofit status that is about education, cultural arts, all sorts of things that the foundation has done for quite a long time. IRC is a 501c4, which is intended, as you said, Michael, to lobby, and to lobby. Lobbying has very specific set of rules. Contributions aren't tax deductible, but lobbying is obviously hugely important. And we're seeing right now in this moment just how important it is to have a voice in Washington. And so when we, as an organization, set out to help with the founders of the IRC, we knew that it was going to require a specific set of coalition parameters, like who are we? There are lobbyists, the National Restaurant Association, who is an ally of ours and has been operating at a very large and influential scale in Washington for some time. But there was still some space, we felt, for folks like those on this town hall, that weren't necessarily being represented in the same way. And as we've heard from the questions today and just the evolution of the IRC, it became clear that people who identified themselves as small, independent, perhaps personality-driven or food-driven or community-driven restaurants didn't feel they had a strong voice or at least as strong a voice as some of the others. And so for us, the process of defining what an independent restaurant is and what an appropriate member of the IRC is begins by saying everyone is welcome. This is a time of political action, and there is strength in numbers. And the reason that this is a coalition is because everybody needs to be supportive of the interests that we have in trying to figure out PPP and making them apply to the restaurant industry. Whether you're the most famous James Beard Award-winning chef, and there are many award winners and nominees and semi-finalists in the IRC leadership, or you're just a neighborhood restaurant who you only know if you live within a 20-block radius, but which is a fulcrum of the community and is really important to be there. And we're trying to represent all of those interests of the small restaurants within the context of the incredibly influential and important restaurant industry, which includes the biggest chains and individual franchisees and the smallest kiosks and takeout trucks and everyone in between. So, and I'm taking more time than necessary, but to say, coming to the point where we have to define who we are, we do feel like there is an important process. We are a group of people, we are a group of restaurants that are run by people and personalities that have some distinctions to be made. And we're trying to, we've undertaken a process of self-definition, which is as expansive as possible, as I said, to build a coalition, but also gets to the heart of what makes each of you work so hard, each of you concerned about your employees, each of you concerned about the farmers and the communities that you support. That we think there's something that separates that group from the entire whole. So we're actually undergoing this process right now where we're going to poll internally, come to some definition of who we think we are, who we ought to be, as Michael said, who we are not. And it will include, for a large part, the business metrics that we can all define what our equity structure is, how big we are, how many employees we have, what our revenue is. But I actually think we're going to get to a point that includes some values about how we choose to operate, how we choose to show up to our communities, how we choose to support our workers and our farmers, and even how we value the sort of craft or hospitality or the craft of service or the craft of cuisine in some way that makes us distinct. That's not to say that anyone who believes in those things or and operates a different type of business isn't part of this coalition, but I do think there's something about the heart of this industry that drives us all to work so hard for such small margins, for the sort of tentative businesses that we run, but do anyway because we're so passionate about it, that we want to also honor as a coalition within the larger context of the industry. So that was a kind of non-definition definition, but I think it's a process and it will evolve, and different aspects of it will be required strategically, which I think is really important, that politics and lobbying and success is about strategy, just as running a successful business is about strategy. And we want to know at the core who we are and who we represent, and who we want to be part of this, and who everyone's welcome, but who is underrepresented perhaps, and find a way to get at something meaningful so that we can apply those definitions strategically and as a coalition move in a way that can be as impactful and as effective for every individual, for every business individually, but for the industry as a whole. Again, you're not going to find what I just said in a dictionary anywhere. It doesn't say this is an independent restaurant and this is who we are. But I do think the process itself will illuminate the sort of value of this coalition vis-a-vis all the other influences and power makers in Washington and elsewhere. That's helpful in some way. As the foundation, I'll say we're committed, as always, this process has really helped us define ourselves and the role that we can play in supporting all of those same people. It's different from lobbying, although certainly not different from advocacy, and we've trained advocates of chefs for years. But I do think that education piece, that support, and what we're calling that, to help everyone open for good, to stay open, to realize, to rebuild, and to thrive is really our function, any way that we can do that, and to be supportive of a community that we know we don't exist without a thriving restaurant community, but we also know that everyone at the foundation is committed to making sure that that community exists whether or not we're around. So we believe there's a true symbiosis between us, the IRC, and every individual restaurant in this country. And so we're looking forward to what I know is a very difficult time now, but the time beyond that, when I think the opportunity for this industry is tremendous in every way, provided we can get through this panic, stressful, will we survive moment, which is real for you as it is for us. That's my spiel.
Thank you, Mitchell. We are almost out of time. We're going to attack the real estate and rent renegotiation conversation. I do want to thank Jason Hamill in Chicago and also congratulate him on his Beard nominee yesterday. But I want to thank Jason for his willingness to join and share his experiences. Hopefully we will have another one of these and we'll do that then. There were a couple questions that I wanted to hit. One of the questions in the chat, can you alert us when's the nuclear option time to engage a full grassroots effort? That time is now. We have the next few weeks to get the stabilization fund into legislation. And if we miss that opportunity, there's not another one around the corner. So this is the time. What I really want to encourage, a lot of folks ask, what can they do besides just send a letter to Congress? If you're a restaurant owner, gather some like-minded independent restaurant owners in your city or town and call the staff of your member of Congress, both your senators and your member of House, and ask them if they'll take a phone call with a group of restaurateurs, and then have a call with them to explain to them the particular challenges that you're having, both using PPP as well as finding the money to reopen, as well as concerns that you have about operating at limited capacity and why we need a stabilization fund. Somebody asked about the EIDL. I'll just tell you that almost everybody in IRC has applied, and I'm not sure that I've talked to anybody who's heard back. So it seems like we're all in the same boat waiting to hear back. And there was a question, is it helpful to have parallel independent restaurant groups get organized in each state? Absolutely. A lot of the folks on the IRC leadership are folks like Jason, who represents the Chicago Independent Restaurant Coalition to the IRC. So it is helpful. And if you are part of a state or city independent restaurant coalition, please let us know. I'll give you the email address in just a minute. And I also want to say, if you're part of a state hospitality association, especially if you sit on the board of one, please lobby them to accept the IRC's suggestions for a carve out in the NRA's proposal. A lot of those state associations are part of the NRA and they have influence within it. So please work internally to try to get your state hospitality association to endorse the IRC's ask. A lot of folks have asked, and myself included, is the IRC here to fight through the COVID, or is it something long-term? I think we've all identified that there's a need for an organization that can speak to Congress on our behalf and lobby on our behalf. So I think we all agree there's a need. I think we all appreciate the community. Whether this thing ends after COVID or continues for a long time to come is really up to us. It's up to our collective efforts, getting engaged, staying engaged when the time is right, and we need funding, helping to support IRC from a funding perspective. So we will write the history of the IRC. It's up to us to make it as powerful, if not more powerful than our NRA. And it's also could be up to us to let it, wrap after this. So I know that I really appreciate the connections that I've made and the insights that I've gained. Thank you everybody for the time spent on the call today. Special thanks to Jeannie Chun, who helped with the planning, and Tara Smith for moderating the day and reviewing every one of 500 questions hundreds of times. So thank you to both of you. Thank you everybody who joined us. And as I said, if you found this useful, we hope to do this again. Please send an email, info@saverestaurants.com, with any feedback about today's presentation, requests, questions, highlights, lowlights, info@saverestaurants.com. If you are out there and you're wondering how you can stay plugged into the IRC, you can send an email to that same address, info@saverestaurants, and just let us know where you are in the country, and we'll connect you with somebody who's part of IRC leadership who lives in your region, and they can help keep you plugged into what is going on here.
Michael, I just have one last plug. If you live in Kentucky, Mississippi, Florida, or Maryland, I would love to hear from you. I'm heading up and working on the DC Hospitality Coalition. You might have seen these things happening on Instagram. These are going to be target areas that we're going to need help in. And if you live in those states and are already active, we would love to hear from you.
Thank you so much. I know we tried to cover a lot today because it was our second town hall and first real chance to dive into the Q&A. So we will probably be back with some single topic ones, and appreciate everyone's time. Have a great Wednesday.